I'm Chris Erickson from Brigham Young University, and my presentation today is on a few of the changes that we've been making to our workflows this past year in order to use our system more effectively. We have several channels for our digital content at BYU. One of them is the commercial product. So for example, we'll have journals that we subscribe to. We don't preserve those within Rosetta. We use Portico. There are websites that we preserve as well, but we use the Archive It utilities to do that. But there are two channels within the organization. One is mostly the production, and with that, that leads to our access. So we have the production workflow goes from the beginning of either acquiring the content or selecting the content through the processing in order to use the content effectively in whatever way we need to. Sometimes we'll use Bit Curator or digital forensics in order to manage those content. We also then will go through and then send it into the repositories for the digital access. Alongside that channel is the digital preservation channel. We begin at the beginning with the selection or the acquisition to make sure that the content that we receive into the digital pipeline is what we need for preservation. And we follow that through so that as the digital content goes through the main production channel, that we make sure that all of the pieces that are handled are in conformance with what we need for digital preservation. So as we go through and add in metadata or transcriptions for the items that we digitize, that they're all in conformance with what it is that we need. These are some of the things that we have done in order to become more efficient. We've tried to get more people at the university involved with ingesting content into Rosetta, into the digital system. And so we've managed to increase those who are participating. It's not just the library. We now have increased to digital archives, the records management, and some of the campus departments as well. Through records management, most of the departments, I think there are about 435 departments on campus so far that are contributing their digital content into Rosetta. What we've also found is that as we use Rosetta as a dark archive, and we have public access systems that we then monitor and make sure that if something happens, then we can replenish the content. And we've had a number of examples during this past year where the digital object in the public access database has either become corrupted or has disappeared for some reason. And so we've put into place the workflow so that from Rosetta we can easily send that content back to the original user. They can put it back into the system, and so we have directional flows in both directions from the creator into Rosetta and from Rosetta back into the public repositories. One of the other things that we've implemented this past year that has made a difference in what we have chosen to do with this is by implementing the digital preservation network. With this, we have the information that is going into the digital preservation network is what we want to have for the scholarly record that we produce. It's going to be the most important information, so only a small percentage of what we actually produce on campus is what we figure qualifies for the scholarly record, and so that percentage is what goes into the digital preservation network from Rosetta. One of the ways we've done this to try to streamline the workflow is to reduce the number of times that we actually have to move or copy the content. And so originally, as the content was going through the pipeline, it would be copied and it would be moved a number of times. And we felt that every time that that was moved or copied, there was a chance for the content to be lost or corrupted. So we have created a file share, which is then accessible to all of the departments that are creating digital content. It doesn't matter whether they are using Windows or Mac products or Linux, that they can all use this same file sharing, and that transfers automatically into our Rosetta processing area. We've also made sure that when we put content into Rosetta, that it's at the last step in the production pipeline, so that all objects are there in their final form, all metadata is there, and transcriptions that we do for diaries or manuscripts or some of those kinds of things, all of that's in place before we put that into Rosetta. And again, as I mentioned before, we can move files that have been deleted or corrupted in our public access systems. We can move that back from Rosetta. The digital preservation, as I've mentioned before, is something that we have become quite interested in because of two reasons. One is it focuses specifically on the academic scholarly record. And so the Digital Preservation Network is a network that has been created by over 60 of the research libraries in the United States. And it was formed in order to provide an opportunity to make sure that the scholarly record is preserved. We send our content into Digital Preservation Network, or DEEPN, and it uses Bagot to implement those and send them into the DEEPN network. We're looking forward to, in the next, as we load the next release, to using Bagot in that way. One of the things that we've done is, as we take the content, we put it into Rosetta, and then we move it from Rosetta, export it, into a folder that is automatically synced with DEEPN. The ingest node that we use for DEEPN is the DuraCloud system. And so when we export it from Rosetta, it automatically goes into a folder that is synced and immediately loaded into the cloud spaces in DuraCloud, which then feed into DEEPN. As we did this, as we started to do that, we realized that we needed some additional information from the selectors for our digital content. If we're going to send in just that content that works with the scholarly record and only the most important content, then we needed to add 2 additional policies in order to capture that information. We have the Digital Preservation Decision Form, which we've used for a number of years, but we found it important to add in the priorities and the level of preservation. So this is the preservation form that every curator, once they're deciding that they want to put content into Rosetta for long-term preservation, they complete a decision form that describes the data, where it's coming from, describes the metadata, and the importance for long-term preservation. We've also now added the priorities. The priorities tell us which items we want to address. And so this is the list of priorities in the highest priority to the lowest. Those things that we create at our institution that are in digital format only, that's the highest priority. This would include the scholarly content created by some of the professors. It includes the theses and dissertations, which now at our institution are done all electronically. There is no physical copy that is created or submitted. So it's important that we maintain a digital copy of this long term. Next, we follow through with digital items that we may own and which may be at risk. Then with items that have a physical copy, but that physical copy may also be at risk. We have a number of manuscripts or early photographs or glass plate negatives, things which we have digitized once, but we do not want to digitize ever again. We don't want to handle them because of the fragility of those items. And so that goes down through. Also, there are some things that we have created where we may have another copy, but because of one thing or another, or the metadata that's been created, it might be difficult or costly to reproduce those items. And then we digitize some things for convenience sake, which are almost never included in our digital archive. We also looked at the levels of preservation, and this says how we preserve the items that we have. We have 4 levels of preservation, which the first is meaning that there is no preservation at all. That's one where the content creator has to take responsibility of their own content. They may put it into library shared servers. They may do their own backups, but there's nothing from the digital preservation department that we do for that content. We have basic preservation, which means that we would put a copy into our content management repository, or we would make a Millenniata disk to put into our reading room, but there's no other processing from there. The things that I deal with are things that have then received the full preservation designation. They go into the Rosetta system, they have format migration, we do regular fixity checks, we have the metadata management, we make multiple copies. We have a copy on Rosetta, we have a copy on tape that goes to a vault outside of our valley, and then we have a copy that we put on Millenniata disk and put into our library vault. For the scholarly content, then, we designate as extended preservation, so it receives the full preservation plus the content is added into the deepen archive. In some cases where, such as with our institutional repository, we may also put a copy in Amazon web storage. So the entire workflow for the digital preservation for these items may look something like this. We start with the selection and acquisition, and this would be for our content producers, the digital lab. It could be our special collections and archives, records management, institutional repository, or others, where they have either purchased or created those objects. We acquire objects in 3 ways. One is that we acquire it, we make it, or we have made it original. So if we make it digital, we have digitized it in some way. It might be born digital, or we acquired it from a donor who said, here are the digital items, and they donate them or sell them to the university. This would be for contemporary authors, and they may contribute disks or hard drives that we then need to handle. From there, it goes into the selection decision process, where they identify those 3 items again, and these are all reviewed either by our board of curators or by our digital collection management committee. From there, it goes into the processing, where again, it might be that we need to do some digital forensics or use BitCurator to manage the content. It might be digitized. We add in the full metadata, and in some cases with special manuscripts, diaries, we also add in transcriptions of each of the pages. And all of that goes into the Rosetta archive. From the processing area, it goes into the final disposition, could go into the public access systems, which would be Content DM, Internet Archive, or bpress, which we use Digital Commons. And then also those things that qualify go into the digital preservation area in Rosetta, and from there would be the multiple copies that we make that are then distributed. This is just kind of, again, a summary of what it is that we do with the digital content. We wanted to make it easier for people to contribute digital content to Rosetta. We wanted to make it possible to replace information or objects that have been corrupted or lost. We want to make sure that the materials that we put into our digital archive fit in with the university mission so that we know exactly what it is we're doing, why we're doing it, and it fits in with the rest of the organizations on campus. And then lastly, we wanted to sync this with the digital preservation network so that we have preservation for those items beyond our institution or beyond the state in which we live. Don't know if there are any questions. If you have, let me know. Thank you.
For the transcripts, Chris, how do you store them in Rosetta?
Sorry?
For the transcripts, you mentioned that you ingest transcripts as well?
Transcripts for students, do you mean, or?
No, transcripts for your digital objects.
Oh, so a transcription or the metadata?
Yes.
There are a couple of ways that we do that. We use Content DM as one of our main public access systems. And so all of the metadata plus the transcripts are added into Content DM, in most cases as a compound object. And so when we gather content from Content DM, we have a harvest tool that will connect to Content DM. It will request the digital object and it will request the XML object from Content DM. So the single record or the compound object. If it's a compound object where there is a transcription, then we receive back from Content DM the page level metadata. So we'll receive the compound object, we'll receive the digital objects, and then we receive the metadata in an XML format for every single page in that. What we then do is we compare that with, if I have the master objects or the TIFF images from our digital lab, I pair those together with that metadata to create the zip file that then goes into Rosetta. In Content DM, we only store the derivative images. So if I have the master images, then I ignore the derivative images, put the master images together with the metadata, and use that to create the zip file. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So with the zip, for instance, the structure of that IE, when you ingest it, is that transcription a sidecar file or is it embedded within the METs?
The METs, we use the METs structure. And so there will be an object, and if, let's say, for example, that there are 5 pages of transcriptions in the object, let's say it's a pamphlet, we will have an object for every single one of those pages, so a TIFF image, and then we will have an XML file which includes the transcript for those same 5 pages. So we're ingesting 10 objects for that item. And then And then when we use the METS file, then we have the file structure and the structure map to order those in the correct order.
So you're using the physical structure map to show relationships between a digital object and its associated transcription?
Correct. Yes, so it has that. Also the naming matches the 2 objects together. So the file name for the TIFF image and the file name for the object have links back to each other. And then the structure map shows what the order and position of each of those are.
Just last question there.
I just wanted to follow up real quick with this one. It just wasn't clear. Is it a single IE?
A single IE
With multiple representations?
with a single representation but multiple items attached to it.
quick question regarding the preservation decision form. Was this developed from scratch? And if yes, how many people were involved?
Yes, I developed it from scratch with our university archivist. So there were two of us. Since then, we put together in the initial form. We passed it through each of the departments who then signed off on it. And we review that each year with our digital preservation committee to make sure that it still fits the current situation. So we update that probably every year.
We've seen 2 pages. Is it just these 2 pages? Or
It's
more?
just those 2 pages. It's fairly simple, and it has been designed in such a way that we can give that to a subject specialist. Might be an archivist, it might be a subject librarian within the university, but it's developed to be simple enough that we can hand that to them, and with a very minimal amount of information, they can follow through that, and it tells them at the end of this process whether the item is to be preserved or not, what the problems are, and what the priority might be.
All right, thank you.
So it is on my website if you're interested in looking at that.
Sir, will we just start questions now? This is still here. Actually, I also have a question, but we'll take it offline. I really would like to understand what's preventing you from stop using the archive and moving also your delivery towards Rosetta, but we'll discuss this later. So again, I would like to thank Chris. Always interesting to see for year after year how the workflows are evolving, how you are able to deepen more and more your integration with the entire campus, and really making Rosetta as a sort of institutional digital preservation repository for the entire campus.